Hi, and welcome to YOW Canada. This video is a sneak peek at our Workplace Violence and Harassment training. Like all our courses, you can log in and out of the training as many times as you need, and the progress is saved automatically. This course is offered in both English and French, includes interactive exercises, and is suitable to all learning styles. You can view a list of products as well as demos for all of our training courses directly on our website, www.yowcanada.com/courses. Please feel free to reach out by email at info@yowcanada.com or by phone at 1-866-688-2845 if you have any questions about our courses or would like more information about our products.
Module 1. How to use this course. Let's take a moment to identify the features. While you are in any module, there are Next and Previous buttons located at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Use these buttons to navigate throughout the course. If you ever need to pause or replay part of the course, you can use the media controller found at the center of the page. Here, you'll also find your speaker volume and mute button. The main menu button located on the bottom left-hand side of the course is available at all times. The main menu will allow you to navigate back to your main course outline. If you have a question, our contact information is also located in the main menu. The main menu also allows you to enable or disable auto navigation. If you are unsure of the meaning of a word used in the course, feel free to check the glossary, which is located in the main menu. It's important to note that this course records your progress and quiz scores as you go through it. If you log out and log in again at a later date, your progress and quiz scores will be restored, and you can continue on in the course from where you last left off, so you don't have to complete all your training at once. Accessibility. Keyboard access. This training program allows you to use your keyboard to navigate. To move to the next and previous slides, you can use the left and right arrow keys. To pause or play the slide, hit the space bar. To replay the slide, hit P. The plus and minus keys increase and decrease the audio volume. To mute the audio, hit the 0. Pressing the N key will highlight the narration window, allowing you to use your up and down arrows to scroll through the text. Hit the M key on your keyboard to access the main menu and cycle through the menu options. Hit Enter to select your desired option. During quiz questions, pressing 1 to 4 will select the associated answer, and hitting Enter will submit it. Any buttons on your slide can be accessed by pressing the Tab key. Module 1. Introduction and Legislation. This module is an introduction to workplace violence and harassment, the legislation, requirements, and responsibilities in Canada. WVH is an acronym. WVH is an acronym that stands for Workplace Violence and Harassment. The Government of Canada defines WVH under the Canadian Labour Code as any action, conduct, or comment, including of a sexual nature, that can reasonably be expected to cause offense, humiliation, or other physical or psychological injury or illness to an employee, including any prescribed action, conduct, or comment. Introduction. Whether you are a novice worker or a veteran employee, workplace violence and harassment, WVH, is a critical health and safety issue facing North American businesses. Most provinces and territories have or are in the process of amending their occupational health and safety regulations to include WVH legislation. Education and training are an important part of any violence and harassment prevention program. Workplace violence and harassment can affect all areas and professions. Patients, customers, and workers could hurt, bully, or harass staff while they are on the job. A number of inappropriate or unacceptable behaviors can take place in a workplace. In general, these behaviors include harassment and bullying, sexual harassment, threats and intimidation, job performance interference, abuse of position or authority, and violence. What you will learn from this course. Upon completion of this course, you will be able to understand what workplace violence and harassment is. Identify clear examples of unacceptable behaviors, working conditions, and their risks. Identify the consequences of making threats or committing acts of violence. Identify the specific workplace violence and harassment risks. Establish standards of behavior and the appropriate responses. Clarify how and who to report violent incidents to. Know the procedures for investigating and resolving complaints. And lastly, know where to find your applicable regulatory requirements. As a result, you and your coworkers will be able to foster a healthy, respectful, and safe work environment. Historical violence. Violence in the workplace. The murder of Lori Dupont. In Windsor, Ontario, Lori Dupont died while tending to patients at Hotel Dieu Grace Hospital on November 12, 2005. Her ex-boyfriend, Mark Daniel, 50, who was an anesthetist at the hospital, stabbed her in the chest. Daniel died several days later of a drug overdose in what was later ruled a suicide. Daniel's abusive behavior was a well-known workplace documented fact. Lori's death has since spurred lawmakers to address issues involving workplace violence and harassment. 3 dead during routine dismissal. On October 15, 2002, in Kamloops, BC, the Ministry of Water, Land and Air Protection became a Wvh statistic when an employee shot his manager and union shop steward. Dick Anderson had just received his termination notice, left the building, and returned 20 minutes later with a handgun. He sought out his manager, who was in a meeting with the shop steward, and shot them both. Shortly thereafter, he turned the gun on himself. 5 dead in Transpo rampage. Pierre Lebrun was a victim of co-workers' harassment at OC Transpo, a public transit service in Ottawa, Ontario. His stutter made him an easy mark, and despite his harassment complaints to management, the matter was not resolved. On April 6, 1999, he showed up at work and shot 4 of his co-workers before taking his own life. Driven by guilt, a co-worker, aware of Pierre's problems and plans, committed suicide 3 months later. Historical harassment. The story of Eric Donovan is one that should serve notice about the potentially tragic impacts harassment in the workplace can have. Mr. Donovan was the victim of workplace harassment. Shortly after returning back to work after a workplace injury, he passed away due to cardiac arrest. After a lengthy litigation process, it was found that his death by cardiac arrest was related to the harassment he received in the workplace. This tragedy has led to updates in PEI's legislation. Wvh alters lives. Countless stories are available about how people's lives have been permanently altered due to violence or harassment on the job. Has this ever happened in your workplace? 2 employees had been arguing over the same assignment. Many weeks of constant personal and heated remarks were exchanged between the 2 coworkers. Supervisors made a few attempts to resolve the situation, but mostly it passed unnoticed. Finally, it became violent, with both workers participating in a physical altercation. They were terminated at once. How do you think you'd react to workplace violence and harassment? Most experts say you would get angry or anxious, become less productive, become less committed to your work, or become more stressed. And if you were the targeted victim, you may experience shock, humiliation and intimidation, stress and fatigue, a loss of sleep and appetite, helplessness, frustration and guilt, or mood swings. The 3 rights. Across Canada, various legislations dictate that workers have 3 basic rights while at work. 1. The right to know. In order to protect their safety and health, employees have the right to be properly informed about the hazards that they may come into contact with while on the job. 2. The right to participate. All workers have a right to participate in a health and safety committee. 3. The right to refuse. All workers have the right to refuse to work in any circumstance that is unsafe. The competent worker. According to many acts and regulations across the country, workers should take the time and effort necessary to be a competent worker. A competent worker is defined as a worker who is qualified because of knowledge, training, and experience to perform the work, is familiar with the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the regulations that apply to their work, and has knowledge of all the actual and potential health and safety dangers in their work. The competent worker. Workplace violence and harassment. When it comes to WVH, the following are a list of objectives an employee must achieve to be a competent worker. 1. Read their workplace violence and harassment policy. 2. Know their rights and responsibilities under this policy. 3. Know the scope of workplace risk factors. 4. Know their company's prevention policy. 5. Know the correct procedures and arrangements to minimize or control the risk of violence and harassment. 6. Know the safe and appropriate responses to incidents, including how to obtain assistance. 7. Know the correct procedures for reporting, investigating, and documenting incidents. 8. Know the follow-up and support services that are available to them in the event of a violent incident. 9. Participate in any mandatory training. A WVH policy should become an integral part of your healthy and safe working environment. Though competent workers play a huge role when it comes to healthy and safe workplaces, businesses know that WVH is an enormous concern, one that requires constant attention. It can affect their employees' health and safety, the company's reputation, and its financial status. But employees and employers can rest assured that distinct Canadian legislation covers WVH even if specific provincial legislation has not yet been developed. The General Duty Clause can be found in provincial OHS legislation. But what does the General Duty Clause mean? WVH defined. The legislation. Under the General Duty Clause, all Canadian employers must take reasonable measures to protect the health and safety of their workers. Although WVH is not specified, this provision implies protecting employees from known risks of workplace violence and harassment. In addition to the General Duty Clause, several provinces have developed their own WVH regulations. These province-specific legislations more clearly define an employer's legal responsibilities when it comes to workplace violence and harassment. Let's check out how workplace violence and harassment differs across the country. Most provinces have defined WVH, but generally, workplace violence is an act in which a person is abused, threatened, intimidated, or assaulted in his or her workplace. Harassment is any behavior that demeans, humiliates, or embarrasses a person, and that a reasonable person should have known would be unwelcome. As a result, workplace violence and harassment prevention requires the employer to conduct a workplace violence risk assessment and establish a workplace violence and/or harassment prevention policy. Using your mouse, click on the province that you work in to see how WVH is defined. As previously mentioned, all provinces and territories have or are in the process of integrating their own Most provinces have Ontario. Violence is the exercise of physical force by a person against a worker in a workplace that causes or could cause physical injury to the worker. An attempt to exercise physical force against a worker in a workplace that could cause physical injury to the worker, or a statement or behavior that is reasonable for a worker to interpret as a threat to exercise physical force against the worker in a workplace that could cause physical injury to the worker. Workplace harassment means A. Engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct against a worker in a workplace that is known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome, or B. Workplace sexual harassment. Workplace sexual harassment means A. Engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct against a worker in a workplace because of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression, where the course of comment or conduct is known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome, or B. Making a sexual solicitation or advance where the person making the solicitation or advance is in a position to confer, grant, or deny a benefit or advancement to the worker and the person knows or ought reasonably to know that the solicitation or advance is unwelcome. As previously mentioned, all provinces and territories have or are in the process of integrating their own legislation for WVH. Using your mouse, click on the province that you work in to see how WVH is legislated. In Ontario, if businesses employ 6 or more workers, they must develop, write, post, and implement separate policies or programs on violence and harassment. If the employer is aware of, or reasonably so, that domestic violence would likely expose a worker to physical injury in the workplace, the employer shall take every precaution to protect the worker. Employers must inform staff when they have to work with persons known to have a history of violence. Less than 6 staff, the policies still need to be developed, but not posted. In addition to the General Duty Clause and other WVH legislation, the Human Rights Code also cites 11 grounds where the employer may be liable for harassment of workers, where they knew or should have known it was taking place and failed to take reasonable action to prevent it. The Criminal Code of Canada refers to violence in the following sections: trespassing at night, Section 177; criminal harassment, Section 264; uttering threats, Section 264.1; extortion, Section 346; false messages, Section 372; and intimidation, Section 423. Businesses which do not comply with the federal or their provincial legislation may face penalties and fines. In February 2017, an Ontario firm that provides security services was fined $70,000 by the Ministry of Labour for failing to comply with an inspector's order to develop a workplace harassment and violence prevention program for its workers. Let's spend a few minutes looking at a violence and harassment policy to see how it's developed. WVH defined, a policy. This is Acme Heating and Cooling's workplace violence and harassment policy. They've developed their WVH policy based on their respective provincial legislation and the required elements. Basic elements of a policy may include, but is not limited to, stating WVH is a hazard in the workplace, defining WVH and where it's found at work, stating WVH is unacceptable and recognizing the harm, explaining the employer's commitment to investigating and dealing with concerns promptly, and encouraging workers to report all WVH incidents and threats. It's also important to spell out the consequences of WVH. Federally regulated industries WVH requirements. In Canada, federally regulated workplaces have additional requirements that they must meet. These requirements include the following. A comprehensive WVH policy is to be created. An assessment to create said policy will be necessary, and an update of that policy is required at least every 3 years. As in all other workplaces in Canada, emergency procedures surrounding possible WVH must be created and implemented. Incident reporting, investigation, and resolution requirements have been updated. And record keeping in the workplace and data sharing with the appropriate government bodies is mandatory. Training requirements have also been updated to define the link between WVH regulations and the Canadian Human Rights Act protected grounds for discrimination. The Canadian Human Rights Act is designed to give all Canadians the ability to live and work free of any discriminatory practice within Canada. The Act lays out prohibited grounds for discrimination, which includes, but are not limited to, a person's race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, marital status, family status, genetic characteristics or disabilities. When harassment targets an individual because they belong to a group protected by the Act, that harassment can count as discrimination. In addition to this course, site-specific training must also be provided. Review the company-specific WVH policy and inform the employees of any assistance and services they may obtain with respect to WVH in their geographic area. As this is a general workplace WVH course, it will not go into details on these requirements. YOW Canada has provided a summary PDF for reference. Click here to view the PDF. WVH, scratching the surface. Commit this to memory. WVH alters lives and affects businesses. The General Duty Clause, as well as provincial legislation, compels employers to take reasonable measures to ensure the health and safety of all staff in the workplace. Remember, under the Canadian Labour Code, WVH is defined as any action, conduct, or comment, including of a sexual nature, that can reasonably be expected to cause offense, humiliation, or other physical or psychological injury or illness to an employee, including any prescribed action, conduct, or comment. WVH includes behavior such as harassment, degrading comments, bullying, threats, intimidation, sexual harassment, sexual assault, and physical or psychological violence. In the following modules, you will learn more specifics about identifying, preventing, and reporting WVH. Welcome to the end of module quiz. Here, you'll be presented with a number of questions that you need to answer. You only have one attempt at each question, and you need to get at least 75% in order to pass, unless otherwise specified on your screen. If you pass, you can continue on to other modules. If you don't pass, you will need to repeat this section and the quiz as many times as you need to until you get a passing quiz score. Good luck!